But my concern is that this will allow weapons to be launched more quickly and increase the risk of accidental war. And this is certainly an escalation of threats, if not of actions. But I think in the next 2 days, we'll see whether Russia makes adjustments to its nuclear force alert levels.
That's the voice of Press the Button co-host Tom Collina discussing recent developments in Ukraine in an extended introduction before today's main interview with Faines and Jasmine Owens of Physicians for Social Responsibility on this week's episode of Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Michelle Dover.
Thanks, Lauren, and welcome back to Press the Button. Today, instead of an early warning interview, Tom and I are going to go straight into talking about what is happening in Ukraine.
Well, Michelle, as you know, a lot is happening in Ukraine, and a lot has happened since our last podcast, and sadly, not much of it very good. As our listeners know, last week Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Already hundreds of lives have been lost. Ukraine seems to be putting up a brave fight against a much larger Russian force. The international community is stepping up with stronger economic sanctions than I would have expected, frankly. But it's a tragic and shocking situation. And here at Plowshares, our thoughts are going out to the people of Ukraine. The photos or the pictures and the videos of them trying to escape are just heartbreaking. But beyond this horrific conventional war, there's also concern that this crisis could spin out of control and increase the risk of nuclear war. And so we want to dig into that a little bit here this morning. President Putin, as many people have heard, has made repeated threats to use nuclear weapons in this conflict. He held nuclear force exercises before it all began, and then reminded the world, as if we needed reminding, that Russia remains one of the most powerful nuclear states. And he threatened consequences you have never faced in your history for anyone who tries to interfere with us. Those were quotes from President Putin. So clear nuclear dimension to this. And then on Sunday, Putin escalated that rhetoric when he told his top defense officials to put nuclear forces on a higher state of alert. We don't know exactly what this means. Russian forces are already on alert and can be launched within minutes, but not all of them and not in the same way. So will Putin put more forces on alert or delegate some of that launch control to someone else? We just don't know. But my concern is that this will allow weapons to be launched more quickly and increase the risk of accidental war. And this is certainly an escalation of threats, if not of actions. But I think in the next 2 days, we'll see whether Russia makes adjustments to its nuclear force alert levels. Now, I'm glad to say that the Biden administration has wisely chosen not to increase its nuclear alert levels in response, because this would cause most likely a Russian escalation again to some higher level. And of course, U.S. forces are already on high alert, can be launched within minutes. So there's no need for the United States to increase its alert level to provide an adequate deterrent. So I think the Biden administration is doing the right thing in this case. So switching to Belarus for a second, soon after all of this happened with the Russian nuclear alert, Belarus passed a referendum that would allow Russian nuclear weapons to be based there in Belarus again, after having been removed 30 years ago at the end of the Cold War, around the same time that Ukraine sent its nuclear weapons back to Russia. Belarusian leader Lukashenko said he could now ask Russia to return those nuclear weapons, or some others, back to Belarus if the West were to transfer nuclear weapons to Poland or Lithuania. So a clear threat from Belarus: if you bring nuclear weapons closer to us, we will bring nuclear weapons closer to you, and hopefully neither side takes those steps. But after 30 years of having nuclear weapons not in Ukraine or Belarus, we could have nuclear weapons back in both countries, which would be a tragic end to that story. And finally, the Biden administration is suspending talks on a new treaty to replace the New START treaty, which was extended at the very beginning of the Biden administration, but expires in 4 years. And Russia is now even talking about withdrawing from the deal. So another setback there. So all in all, Michelle, a pretty grim picture.
It really is. And I think there's a couple things that have really struck me on this. One, just how fast this whole situation has moved. I mean, the Russian invasion began, we're taping this on a Monday. It happened less than a week ago. And we are already at the point that you are seeing world leaders invoking nuclear threats. And I think that just highlights how quickly things can escalate. And, I really do worry right now more about the risk of miscalculation. Tom, you were talking about what it appears that, how Ukrainian forces are putting up a substantial fight against the much larger Russian forces. And it's true, but I've been struck by how much information we don't have and how challenging it is to get a full understanding of what this war actually looks like. And so you combine that lack of information, the amount of disinformation and misinformation that we're seeing on social media, and I really, really worry about how that's going to affect nuclear decision making.
Completely agree. What worries me is the misinformation, the cyber attacks, particularly in a case where Russian nuclear forces are in a higher state of alert. They can be potentially launched more easily. Putin is clearly in a paranoid mood. What if there's misinformation that, NATO or the United States is launching a nuclear attack against him? Does he respond in a way that flies off the handle and thinks he's being under attack and so makes a mistake and launches nuclear weapons under false information? That's the nightmare.
No, and I think this is a moment for me, at least. I'm looking at it. Nuclear weapons are not de-escalating the situation. They are making it much worse. And so, Tom, the question I have for you is, you hinted at this, but why do you think Putin is elevating it this way?
We don't know. There's a number of theories about this. I mean, it certainly shows that the war in Ukraine could get more dangerous and that Putin is making nuclear threats to get what he wants. Would he actually use those weapons? I certainly hope not. But the bottom line is we just don't know. I mean, I didn't think Putin would launch an invasion like this into Ukraine. I really did not. I'm finding it really shocking. If you compare this invasion to 2014 and the invasion into Crimea and eastern Ukraine, it's like night and day. I mean, in that case, Russia was trying to avoid being blamed for it, right? They weren't even putting their flag, their insignia on the invaders. This is completely 180 degrees different. Putin is just like, it's us, we're going full bore. I mean, and we don't care what the international response is. This is a new Putin, much, much more aggressive. And why? Maybe Putin is losing his grip on reality. I was kind of, shocked to see that former National Intelligence Director James Clapper said on CNN that he thinks Putin is unhinged and he worries about his acuity and balance, right? I mean, we've always known that Putin and President Trump had a lot in common, but let's hope it's not this. So that would be tremendously dangerous. But again, Putin is an isolated autocrat, right? He's not getting real information from his advisors, or at least we don't think he is. He's not getting a real analysis of the situation. And certainly no one is bringing him bad news or thinking that he should change what he's doing. So he's an isolated leader making decisions in a very dangerous situation. And it's very, very concerning. I don't want to shift the blame from Putin in any way. I mean, he's completely responsible for this crisis. But looking back, I think we have to say, look, the Cold War ended 30 years ago, and what have we been doing with that time? Why hasn't nuclear policy changed more? We've simply waited too long to change these policies. I mean, both the United States and Russia should long ago have taken nuclear forces off alert. We should have long ago set up some kind of verifiable, predictable pledge that neither would use nuclear weapons first, but we never did. And so here we are in another nuclear crisis without the rules of the road that we should have had. And I just wish we had those policies in place today.
I fear that this will not be a single incident, right? I mean, if countries around the world that have nuclear weapons are modernizing their arsenals, are increasing the role that nuclear weapons play in their defense posture or their national security strategy, you're increasing the chances that you are going to run into these types of crises. So I know it feels really powerless. I just saw Joe Cirincione say on Deep State Radio that this feeling of fear is a completely normal reaction. But I want to take a step back. There is, and he would agree, there is something that you can do. You can learn. So continue to follow reputable sources like Federation of American Scientists, the open source analysts out at the Monterey Institute, the analysts at the Arms Control Association. Will keep bringing on guests here on the podcast, like Kimberly St. Julian Varnon and Terrell Germain Starr, to help explain what we know and what we don't. And then get involved with groups like Beyond the Bomb, Women's Action for New Directions, Foreign Policy for America, Global Zero, ICANN, Physicians for Social Responsibility, Union of Concerned Scientists. Take a look around at those groups. That was not an exhaustive list, so see who's out there in your local community and reach out and see and call your member of Congress or your parliamentarian, whoever represents you in the political system, to say that you want to see a reduction in nuclear threats and the actions that they can take to do so.
Michelle, couldn't agree more. If people are feeling worried and anxious, I think the best antidote to that is get involved somehow. Get educated, get active. I think that'll take care of a lot of the anxiety we can't control. So couldn't agree more. Just want to set up our interview that's coming up next, because it was really a lot of fun, and I hope people stick around for it. I sit down with Mari Faines and Jasmine Owens. They're from Physicians for Social Responsibility, and they're the campaign organizers for PSR's Demand Access campaign, which, timely enough, is focused on the ways we can get the nuclear community intersecting with other social justice movements. And if we want the public to be more engaged with nuclear policy, which we do, this is just what we need to do, and you won't find anyone doing it better than Mari and Jasmine, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
There has been talk and concern in the nuclear policy community that we are too insular, too isolated from other communities, and that by reaching out and building connections, maybe we can expand our reach and build greater awareness and impact. Simply put, we need more people to care about nuclear policy. So how do we engage with other movements to build power and momentum? Well, some people are actually doing it. The great group Physicians for Social Responsibility, also known as PSR, has started focusing on this question with their work on the Demand Access campaign. This 3-part event series explored how we can work on nuclear weapons policy and social justice issues together. And here to discuss what we can learn from other social justice movements, we have the Demand Access campaign organizers, Mari Faines and Jasmine Owens, both at PSR. Mari is the Director of Communications and Outreach, and Jasmine is the lead organizer and policy coordinator for the Nuclear Weapons Abolition Program. Thank you both so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you so much.
So my first question is, for the benefit of our listeners, can you please explain the purpose of the Demand Access campaign and what inspired you to do it?
So Demand Access actually predates both Jasmine and myself. It was originally an ideology that was based in fund healthcare, not warfare, thinking about, as a physicians organization, how do we make a more healthy and sustainable world? And as we went through the process and we talked to young health professionals over the summer, what we realized was, like true millennials, many of them, they have their hands in a lot of different pots and care about a lot of different issues. And so when we were having conversations with them about nuclear weapons abolition, they also wanted to talk about things like health access and equity, racial and social justice, housing injustice, economic disparities. You run the list and the gamut of things that were pressing their mind. And when we were able to talk about nuclear weapons abolition in a way in which to intersect with these other thoughts that they were having and these other crises we were trying to solve, that's where demand access was born. It is out of that place of thinking there is an underpinning and a thread between all of these issues that we need to demand more access to and for as a people.
And can you explain, what is that place of intersection? What are the issues from nuclear weapons policy that appeal most to people that are thinking about other social justice issues?
I think the kind of most obvious and attractive intersection between nuclear weapons and other social justice issues is the money aspect, because we are spending soon to be over $800 billion on our military budget. Meanwhile, other aspects of our government is atrophying. Our public health infrastructure is not what it should be. Our education system is not what it should be. And people are fed up with that. And so the way that we can really bring people into this conversation is say, look, all of these things that are kind of ailing your daily life, like not having access to proper healthcare, being worried about leaving your front door and being shot by the police or being pulled over for no reason, astronomical student loan debt. So many things could be solved by simply pouring more resources into these avenues that would greatly improve everyone's lives. And that's not happening because our government has mismanaged priorities, focusing on the military and expecting the military to solve so many of our problems. And that's not feasible in this world today. The military cannot address all these problems. The military cannot, solve climate change for us. We have to start investing in other aspects of our society if we truly want to be able to move forward and protect ourselves against these threats that are both happening right now, today, and also future threats.
Jasmine, that's a great point. And hopefully people are coming to realize the trade-offs that we face from a federal budget perspective, right? We can only do so much in one area, and it's going to have an effect in another area. And certainly the defense budget is hugely outsized. And of course, we're underfunding other areas. Although I'm sorry to say that debate is going to get much harder for us now that Russia has invaded Ukraine. Not to bring too many issues into this, but the environment just got a lot harder. So that's a challenge for all of us. At your events, you discussed this issue of the intersection between social justice movements and nuclear weapons. What do you think the nuclear weapons community should be doing differently to join forces with other movements?
We've said this so many times, and I think I previously said this on this show. We need to humble ourselves every time we walk into a room. We need to put our listening ears on and understand what is going on in other people's lives. So much of what demand access is and will continue to be is recognizing that there are very real proximate threats in people's day-to-day lives. And they have to deal with those things eminently. And yes, they can understand the existential threat of nuclear war. It's not a hard concept for people to grasp. They understand the hypermilitarization of our society. What we need to understand as a group, as a field, is that for many people, myself and Jasmine included, we live in a duality. We have to deal in racial issues, gender issues, et cetera. And then we also have to get up and we have to come to work and we have to work on these large scale issues. And so what I think the field needs to think about as it attempts to integrate and intersect authentically with other movements is, how can we not be transactional? How can we be tried and true in our movements to work with people? I think about, Black Lives Matter, for instance. They talk about hypermilitarization in communities. They talk about things, including the 1033 bill. They understand what the defense military spending budget is doing, both to nukes and doing to policing in urban communities. That's not a hard conversation to have. But if you don't walk into the room ready to listen first and see how do we have a more fruitful and beneficial conversation for all parties, then we're screaming on deaf ears because we're not acknowledging their own threats that they're talking about in the immediate. And that list runs the gamut. The environmental justice movement understands the military costs and effects on environmental justice. We can keep listing immigration wherever we want to go, but we don't have to be the loudest voice or the most forceful voice to get our point across. And I think sometimes that is where we fall short in conversation.
Yeah. I would also add that something that we also kind of need to take into account too is like intersectionality is more than just actionable items. It's also a framework, and you really have to implement it in kind of everything you're doing within your work, because only then can you really, I think, truly see success with intersectionality. Like Mari said, where, that's where you avoid these transactional interactions where, where you're, being like going into the room and saying, here's why you need to care about this. And here's how how can you help me? Having it be more reciprocal and having that actually building real relationships with people and really trying to build a strong and fruitful movement. So, and that can be very daunting, and it is a lot of work, and it's not something that can happen within, a certain amount of time frame. It's something that's going to be ongoing. And we just have to remind ourselves that, this is something we have to actively work towards every day.
So part of the challenge here, I'm assuming, is that you're not only doing your nuclear policy work, but to show up for other people, you're taking on their issues too. How do you balance that so that you're getting, quote unquote, your own work done while also showing up for those other communities? How do you get all that done?
Honestly, I think what Jasmine just touched on is something that we keep telling people is you have to do the work yourself first, right? So much of intersectionality is understanding your own privilege, your own placement in society, and it's going to look different for different groups of people. And so the place to start is really at home, thinking about why you do the work you do and how you do the work you do. This field, what you just said, Tom, you talk about how do you show up for others, but also show up for your own work. This field is filled with people who sit in diverse intersections, and they are doing both of those things by merely existing in that space. If we take the time to listen, to understand how they are doing that, and then others continue to better themselves, then we can have a more holistic field that is thinking outwardly about what is going on in the rest of the world, but also how do we fix our own issues. It's difficult. There's no question that choosing to do this work is not easy. But I often tell people, think about what it must feel like for people that live in that intersection to exist every day when people are telling them it is difficult to work on their diversity of issues. They still have to live that reality. And whether we're talking about basic frontline communities in the nuclear field, giving them more acknowledgement, I think about, RECA and other things, or whether we're talking about how we can better integrate with movements that are technically outside our field. People are living that existence. And so thinking about your own effects is truly the first place to start.
So you all just got finished with a great 3-part series where you had some terrific panelists. What stories to you stood out that are most memorable? And what are some of the questions you got from listeners that have sort of stayed with you?
I think one of the first ones that sticks out to me was the very first event that we had. And we had a panelist, Nola Hayes, who for me has always been somebody that I looked up to in the nuclear field. I think she is a fascinating person who truly embodies what intersectionality looks like. And one of the things that she said.
Tell us who she is for our listeners that don't know.
Nola is, well, now you can catch her on NBC and a lot of other places because she is one of the Black female pundits talking about Ukraine and Russia. She talks about how she does her work intersectionally. She's a professor. She used to be a TV host. She is well versed in national security and nuclear disarmament. She has focuses on China and Russia. She truly runs the gamut of things when you think about this field. And most prominently right now, she is the director of Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security West Coast chapter. And she got on the panel and she talked about her experiences as a Black woman and how often people would bring her into the space solely to discuss issues of race. And what she would tell them is, I can always discuss issues of race, but you better believe I can also talk about the China threat. I can also talk about Russia and Ukraine. I can also do all these things and then come back and tell you how things are interlinked. And those comments and those stories that she told from her own experience of being in the field was, to me, the embodiment of what demand access is supposed to be. It's acknowledging the holistic duality of so many people that operate in this field and saying that we don't need to have a monolithic narrative around what nuclear disarmament and what the policy and the field needs to look like. It is amplifying grassroots in the same conversation that we're amplifying policy. And so the more she spoke, I know we got a lot of comments where people were saying things like, I feel seen. I enjoy being in this room. I've never thought about these issues in this way. And that was one of the first moments for myself that I said, oh, we might be onto something. This might not just be a me thing. This might not just be a Jasmine or a PSR thing. People are starting to see themselves in this work who didn't see themselves before.
Yeah, I think that's so important, because what Nola and Mari retold, talking about how people of color are not only good for talking about, diversity, equity, inclusion, and, intersectionality. Like, we have so much experience, so much knowledge on so many different topics. And I think something that the nuclear community could definitely benefit from is platforming more people of color. Because often, unfortunately, we keep seeing the same people, getting the platforms and giving a voice, having the opportunity to speak on things. And we could really benefit from more, not just diversity in who's talking on it, but with that comes just more diversity in perspectives and different and new and innovative ways of like thinking about these issues and talking about them. And that is so important. And I'm so happy that Nola touched on that, because I think that's something that the nuclear community in specifically does actually really need to work on.
I really appreciated having Lily Adams on our last panel.
I was going to talk about her.
I genuinely appreciate. Now, for Jasmine and I, Lily is a friend, but I appreciated her perspective, because that is somebody that truly works at the intersection of grassroots and policy and does it effectively and does it well. And so to have her perspective on the intersection between social justice and nuclear weapons abolition was unique, because she deals in frontline communities. She deals in affected populations, but she also deals with policy people on the Hill. So her intersectionality and her point were going to be different than other people we had previously on who spent times talking about, their racial diversity, which is equally as important. But Lily was able to articulate why intersectionality is more than just a conversation about racial diversity. It is more than just a conversation about gender diversity. It is diversity in thought, diversity in economics. It is really finding a middle point so that diverse perspectives are appreciated. And from listening to her own experience of having to amplify the causes that she worked on, I think people truly had to think about their framing of nuclear disarmament differently and what is important.
Yeah, Lily is spectacular. And I think she truly is one of the major reasons why RECA is getting so much attention right now. The work that the RECA Coalition is doing is phenomenal. And it really touches on how you do have to approach intersectionality very kind of sensitively, in a way where you can't go in and kind of impress upon other people your opinions and how you view this, because not everyone has the same opinions. Within that coalition, there are people who think that we should get rid of nuclear weapons, and there are people who don't. And, it's about finding ways that we can, merge these different schools of thought together to advance this broader goal of justice. Because despite their own personal opinions about nuclear weapons, they are all being impacted by them right now. And they all would like to, be compensated for that and be acknowledged that like the pain and the loss and everything that they're going through is real and it's valid. And it just really shows that this is something that is so close to some people's hearts. And so you really do have to kind of move very carefully through intersectionality and make sure that, the way you're doing it is very respectful.
Great point. And just for the benefit of our listeners, you mentioned RECA. Just tell us what that is.
RECA is the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, and it's a program that provides compensation to individuals who have been exposed to radiation due to, nuclear testing and mining within the United States. Unfortunately, the bill doesn't cover everyone who has been impacted. It only covers a small portion, and it's also expiring in July of this year. So there's a really big push to get the bill both extended for another 19 years and also expanded to be more holistic and comprehensive and help everyone who's been impacted by these weapons, not just, a select few.
And this, of course, is a great opportunity to bring sort of public health and nuclear policy together in one place. So, as you look at the totality of your campaign, what are your takeaways? What did you learn?
I'm going to be honest with Tom. I think we're still learning. What this event series did, it catalyzed the beginning of the movement that we're trying to create around demand access. It opened the conversation about what does social justice and nuclear weapons abolition look like when it finds a center point between these two important movements. One of the things that I took away was that there is a need and a want for this type of education. The more that we held these events, the more that we diversified our panels, the more that we amplified a myriad of different voices, the more that we watched people engross themselves into these causes and champion these people. I've truly watched as those who were considered in the shadows have now been in the forefront. And what we're learning is when you give people the platform, when you give people the time, great things can happen. This doesn't have to be a siloed conversation of the DC Beltway. It can be an everyday coffee table conversation. And so when we think about demand access and moving forward, I think about this exact moment right here with Ukraine and Russia. Demand access is the type of place where we're not just going to talk about the nuclear weapons effects. We're going to talk about things like the effects that this is going to have on immigration and asylum seekers, right? There is an intersectional point that makes everybody a part of this conversation. And we were able to draw on different groups and different people. And now they are more engrossed in the nuclear weapons abolition movement, and the same way we will now show up for them and the things that they are doing. There is a need in the peace and justice space for intersectionality, for unification. And we're hoping that this is one of the places that people can find a home for that type of work.
Yeah. And I think another thing that I've learned, and I think, other people have learned through this process too, is that intersectionality and this fight for, justice for all, it's going to get messy at times. It's not always going to be pretty. It's not everything's going to work out exactly, as you think it should. You're going to mess up along the way. And the most important thing to remember is that is okay, because, this is new. It's kind of uncharted territory for, our community, because we have been so siloed. And so I think a huge takeaway is don't be afraid to just get down into it, because if you make a mistake, that's okay. You correct it and you move on, you learn from it. And I think some people are so afraid that if they do make a mistake, especially when it comes to like intersectionality and DEIJ efforts, that, they're going to be called out, or like, it could be some huge thing, but it's like, depending on what it is, that's not necessarily the case. This happens. And the way that we are going to move forward is to make those mistakes and to learn from them and to grow. And I think that's just something that, we could all benefit from, that, mistakes are good. We need this.
Yeah, to that effect, Jasmine and I know one of the key slogans that we had when we were coming up with this campaign is to meet people where they are. And that's going to look different for every group that we're talking to. We were meeting longstanding people who have been in this movement, who have done it one way, where they were, to tell them about something new. We were meeting other social justice activists to tell them about nuclear weapons abolition somewhere else. But we were hoping that by meeting people where they are in this conversation, we allow for the mistakes to be made, but also for people to be humble enough to say, I'm sorry. If there's a
Mhm.
mistake made, to apologize, to learn, to grow, and to move forward. We would be lying if we didn't say there were moments in some of these events where there were hiccups, where there were things like microaggressions and other things that people are trying to muck and muddy through. But our ability to call them out, talk about them, have people be comfortable being uncomfortable shows that there is an opportunity for growth and learning. And I think that's something that we'll take away, is to continue to create safe spaces for people to grow and learn.
That takeaway, being comfortable with being uncomfortable. That is the key.
The key. That is the key.
Great point. And the point you made about meeting people where they are, I think it's just so essential. It's like, the first rule of good organizing is meet people where they are. Last question. After all you've learned from your campaign and are still learning about your campaign, what's next?
So technically the campaign has only just started. This 3-part series was just a launch for it. And what's next is we're building a steering committee of young health professionals to help guide us and help us to ensure that as we're leading with this campaign, we're putting the public health perspective in it and, getting that insight and that knowledge from people who are actually doing the work. And that's so key and that's so important. So as we build that steering committee, we're going to then be doing more events in the future and trying to just build a broader movement behind not just this campaign, but the nuclear abolition movement, writ large.
Yeah. This is really the start of the conversation for us. So you can anticipate that we'll continue to do events, continue to publish articles, continue to integrate with other movements and bring people in to show the diversity of what this movement could look like if we championed more than one thing, more than one type of person, and really what will move us forward. The sky is the limit, to be 100% honest with you. This work, as Jasmine said, it's longstanding. Intersectionality didn't happen yesterday, and there have been people fighting for these intersections for generations. All we're doing is picking up the mantle and attempting to put our own spin on it. So we are excited about what is to come. You can expect to see a young, diverse, and intersectional cohort of people continuing to champion these issues. And we hope that all of the allies in this work become accomplices, get their hands dirty, and get involved in making this the equitable movement that we hope that it will continue to be.
Mari and Jasmine, thank you so much for bringing your passion and energy to this work and onto this podcast. I'm a huge fan, and best of luck with all your work going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Kelly, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Bill, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Pettis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.